This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and this is just so cool to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas. I mean, what we're talking about today is kind of super big. It's like super big times 6, but I get to talk about it with these really interesting, accomplished people of goodwill, people who come in good faith. And it is an honor to announce that our program is now part of the Democracy Group, which is a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Now, I'm going to say the typical podcast thing. Remember to subscribe, follow, rate, review. But, it really is a big deal, especially for us independent podcasts. When you subscribe to our program or follow us, depending on which app you're on, not just rate us, but if your app allows you to give us a review, it really makes a big difference. It's been super cool, encouraging to see our little program is rising up in the rankings. It allows other people to discover us. Really, the little thing that you do where hopefully you hit the 5 stars and leave comments, leave an actual review. It really does make a difference, and I appreciate that. And we appreciate hearing from you. And it allows folks to be included in the types of conversations like the one we're having today with Dr. Jean Twenge. Dr. Jean Twenge, PhD, is a professor of psychology at San Diego State University and has written extensively on generational change, including many scientific papers, several books, including her most recent one titled Generations, which we'll be discussing at length today. Dr. Twenge's work, this really struck me. Dr. Twenge's work is on generational differences and technology is based on a database of 39 million people. So I just have to say that again, 39 million people. I pointed out because I sometimes get into conversations with folks who say, no, man, I've done my research. And that often means, I talked to some guy at the gas station. I don't know, but 39 million people. So that's a big deal. Dr. Twenge, having read so much of your work and been following a lot of your interviews, this is such an honor to be spending time with you today. How are you doing? You must be very tired from talking to 39 million people.
Yeah, I'm very lucky I did not have to collect that data myself.
Well, in all seriousness, so that must be something relatively new to, as opposed to when you first started your research, doing your work, when you were in undergrad, graduate work, doing your PhD work, must be very different to be able to have access to that scope of data. So how is that different, and how do you do that?
Yeah, we're in the age of big data now. That's what's so amazing is there are these enormous surveys. A lot of them are government funded, and they go back decades. So we can compare people at the same age, but at different points in time to really dial down into what's really a generational difference, what has really changed about young people or middle-aged people, how are they really different? And it is wonderful to have access to that much data compared to, how I started, which was, giving about 150 of my fellow students at the University of Chicago a couple of questionnaires. And realizing that they look different from the 1970s test manual. That's kind of how I got started, with thinking about generations. And then did meta-analyses for a while. So that was, a lot of work in libraries and other places. And now it's so amazing to have these nationally representative data sets that you can download. Now, it's still work. There's still a lot of, behind the scenes sausage making when you have to merge these data sets and do these analyses. But at least I'm not handing out millions of questionnaires.
One of the things I was curious about with that large of a data set is how you read it. It's not like you're reading individual stories, even with 1,000 people, which, for a lot of folks, that would sound like a pretty substantial study. But with that large of a data set, how do you begin to analyze it? I guess quantitative is one thing, but qualitatively, what are the differences there?
Yeah, so these are all quantitative data sets. So they give, they're surveys. So they ask certain questions. I mean, I'll just use as an example, I looked at mental health quite a bit in this new book. And, surveys handle this differently. This is one of the great reasons it's wonderful to draw from more than one, because so one that asks about mental distress in 6 questions about, how you're feeling, if you feel anxious or down. Then there's another that has 8 questions that are a standard measure of depression. Then there's another that just has a really general question. How many times in the last month did you have poor mental health? And it defines it by talking about, that you were stressed or felt sad. So they all ask it in somewhat different ways. Yet the results are pretty similar across these data sets, even though they ask these questions in different ways. And it's really nice, because then you can get a much broader picture of what's really going on with more people using different methods.
Right, right. You also talk early in the book about the difference between, and I forget the acronym that you used, but sometimes the tendency is to say, well, that's a generalization, and you used an illustration of seatbelts. Oh, my friend ended up getting strangled by the seatbelt. So could you make that distinction for us, the generalities versus specific situations? And what's the acronym again? Forgive me for forgetting.
Yeah, well, you know what? To be truthful, I forget the acronym pretty much all the time as well. But the concept is what's important, right? So there's a couple things here. So in with stuff on generations, really with anything about group differences, there's the standard criticisms. And one of them is, oh, you're stereotyping. Well, if you're using actual data, you're not. You're looking at average differences. And yes, it's true, any one individual is not necessarily going to fit the average. But that's true of any study of any group. It's true for gender differences, regional differences, as well as for generations. Then there's the other thing of, and this is the one where the easy to forget acronym comes in, which is the idea that if you can think of one exception, then that means the average isn't true. I know a Gen Xer who's not cynical. So that means, you don't have any kind of average difference in cynicism or lack of trust among Gen Xers, but you do, and that shows up in surveys. So it's the idea that you can disprove something by finding an exception, which of course is not true, because of course there's plenty of variation within each generation. But again, that's true of any study of group differences.
Yeah. So as I was reading through the book, by the time I got to the chapter on millennials, I remembered an experience I had about 5 or 10 years ago. And I was at a wedding, and the bride and groom were both in their mid to late 30s. So of course, my mother, being the perfect Jewish mother from New York, was like, I thought they would never get married. I thought he was gay, But at one point in the wedding, it was after dinner and people were dancing, and people my parents' generation, my parents were born in 47. So they're like on the beginning side of boomers, and my aunts and uncles are a little older than them. They were dancing, but they were dancing like the Lindy, or, the cool ones were doing the hustle. My friends and my cousins, we were dancing together, but we were dancing not like a formal ballroom dancing. And then the millennials, the kids that were the bride and groom age and a little bit younger, they were dancing, but it was almost like they were in this glass silo of themselves. And like they were in their imaginations, they were Kid Rock or Beyonce, like almost in their own minds. And then I started looking around, where are my kids? Where are my kids? And they were all sitting by themselves, each on their phones doing nothing.
So, there you go.
So okay.
That is generations in a nutshell, isn't it? And I remember being very struck by this too. So, when I was in high school, I would go to dances, and I'm a Gen Xer, so that, we would dance in a certain way. And then I think it was like maybe a family reunion or anniversary party or something. And I see my parents dance, and it's like this thing, yeah. Like what? But that's, and then my dad asked, had they dance with me, and I'm like, I don't even know how to do this. I have no idea how to do this.
Right. So, you start the book, even before the book starts, you start in a really touching way. In the dedication, you said, for my parents, Joanne and Steve, yeah, witnessed the birth of 6 generations, and for my children, Kate, Elizabeth, and Julia, who will see many more. So is that why you do what you do, trying to understand people in your life and the differences and similarities among us?
It really is about understanding, and I think that's really the overall goal of my work and this book in particular is I think we're living in a time now where generation gaps are just as big or even bigger than they were, say, in the late 60s between boomers and their parents. I think there's just as much misunderstanding and miscommunication. So I think this is a time when we need to understand each other better, to step away from some of the stereotypes and misperceptions. What are the real differences? How can we communicate better? How can we make those connections? How can we understand the generations older than us and younger than us? I think as a Gen Xer, Gen X is the middle child of generations. So maybe that's part of my motivation here, is just realizing that we need to try to take each other's perspective more.
Yeah.
And there's often a fascination of the older generation trying to understand the younger. Of course, they also criticize them a lot. They're also trying to understand them. And then younger people, sometimes there's a tendency to maybe they want to understand the older generation because it's their parent or their boss. But there's also the dismissive idea of like, you guys are done and maybe we don't need to understand you. But I think we could all be better served to try to have that empathy across the spectrum.
So getting very specific, what about young Gene, before you were Dr. Twenge? At what point did you start thinking about these questions? Was it around when you were 16, looking around your Thanksgiving table, or was it something that you arrived at later in undergraduate, graduate work? How did you come to this line of study?
I mean, I can remember in high school being fascinated by some of the history of the, late 60s, early 70s. So when the boomers were young adults and things were changing. But it really happened when I was an undergraduate. So I was working on my college honors thesis at the University of Chicago, and I was really interested in gender and gender roles. I'd been interested in that for quite a long time. So I gave a questionnaire to about 150 of my fellow students that measures, stereotypically, traits that are stereotypically associated with one gender or another. So the masculine scale, kind of a misnomer these days, but it has things like being a leader and being assertive. And my fellow female students were scoring very high on that scale in the early 90s compared to the 1970s test manual. And that made sense when I thought about it. At first, I had to make sure I was scoring it right because, as an undergrad, I had to make sure I knew what I was doing. But it was correct. And then the next year, as a grad student at the University of Michigan, I gathered the other journal articles, other scientific studies that had used the same questionnaire since the 70s. And there was a virtually straight line for average scores for college students, for both men and women, particularly for women, in those traits of identifying with being a leader or being assertive. It just went up from the early 70s to the early 90s. And it makes total sense given the changes in women's roles over that time. So that was the first generational study that I did. And then I realized that this was a great topic. It was the early 90s. People were talking about Gen X, but really not using a whole lot of data to do it. Yet it was something that looked at the influence of culture on people. And it really hadn't been studied much in psychology, quite to my surprise.
Right.
So as a grad student, that's what you want, something that's very interesting, but it really hasn't been studied that much. It's very rare to find that. But stuff on generational differences fit that description.
When I was looking at your background, one of the things that surprised me, I was expecting to see an emphasis on sociology more so than psychology. But are the two intertwined, really? Is it a parallel path, or is one very distinct from the other?
So I was actually a double major as an undergraduate. Sociology is where I started, and then I kind of added in psychology. It's funny, academia is weird. It, for decades, has said we want people to be multidisciplinary because that makes sense, to approach things from many different things. They don't actually want you to be multidisciplinary. It makes it much harder to get a job and to publish in journals. So I am a psychologist. That is how I was trained. But it is true that the study of generations historically has been within sociology. So I really use both fields in my approach.
So speaking of multidisciplinary, I'm going to get deep into the book here, but I got to ask you about charts. I was totally geeking out on your charts. Do you do your own charts? Like, how do you come up? Do you have like an EVP of chart making, or how do you do all that?
Oh my God. Yeah. I am an idiot. I make my own charts. I really
awesome.
don't know how else to put it. I remember talking to my editor about this because it's one of those things that yes, I really probably should have somebody else do it, but it's so essential to how I write to have the chart in there to show the data, because that idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
I think a chart's worth 2,000, maybe even more, because what you can convey in terms of the data and the change and the trends in a chart is just so far beyond what you can write in a page or two. So so I do the analyses. That's actually my favorite part. I love doing the analyses, even though it can be very time consuming and frustrating sometimes, and then making the charts.
It really is something. You flip through the book, and I'm thinking, it's a big undertaking.
Yes.
I mean, even as a reader, let alone putting it together. And I flip through, okay, there's a lot of charts in here, but it's kind of a trap, because I found myself just kind of settling on charts, and like it would take me, instead of 10 minutes per page, I would just sit on a chart and just like really absorb the information. But it really is terrific, because from a learning standpoint, you're digesting information from an articulated standpoint, but then you're digesting it from a visual standpoint, an illustrated standpoint. So it's really helpful to get a grasp on exactly what we're talking about. So the book, Generations, really is, I mean, not just because you're here, but I think this is going to be one of those books that's going to be continually referenced by other academics, other leaders, to help us get a better understanding of not just this moment in time, but these half a dozen generations, and how we're relating. And it also, by the end of the book, looking into the future. But so let's get into it a little bit. One of the most striking conclusions you come to, and this really surprised me, that what shapes generations is not so much historical events, so much as technology. So I was hoping you could describe how you arrived at the conclusion, and maybe give us some illustrations of technological advances helping to shape a generation over and above major events. Yeah,
because the classic theory of generations is that major events like wars and economic depressions and recessions and pandemics, that is really what shapes a generation. That's where their attitudes and values and personality traits come from. But I've always found that somewhat lacking. And with this book, I kind of managed to put it together. This is really the book that I've been preparing to write my whole career. But starting with my first book, Generation Me, about the millennials, it was clear that millennials weren't really shaped by the events that they may have, that they experienced and talk about, say like 9/11 or the Great Recession. Yes, absolutely, those had an impact on them, but it doesn't really define who they are. For example, what really defines who millennials are, what they really grew up with, was individualism. This cultural system of individualism, more focused on the self and less on others, that had been building since the boomers. It had the individualism had a big impact on Gen X as well. And then with my next book about Gen Z, I was realizing some of the direct effects of technology, so smartphones and social media, and how big of an impact that had on today's teens and young adults. And then in that book too, I started to explore something called the slow life strategy, that people just take longer to grow up now, that kids are less independent, teens are less likely to get their driver's license, to go out of the house without their parents, to have a paid job, to go out on dates. Young adults take longer to get married and have kids and settle into a career. And middle-aged people look and feel younger than their parents or grandparents did at the same age. So even though at first I was thinking about this in terms of teens, it's that the developmental trajectory slowed down for everybody. So in kind of trying to put all these things together, all these influences, I realized technology is at the root. It's at the root of all of those things. Technology has meant better medical care and longer lives. That's what leads to the slower life. And then technology makes individualism possible, that allows people to be more independent, to have the time to reflect on themselves, and to be able to flatten or at least try to wipe away a lot of those differences and prejudices based on group membership, which is part of individualism. Technology helps with that too. And then there's the direct effects of it. Because you really think about what makes living now so different from living 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. It's not major events. That's not what's had the biggest impact on day-to-day life. It's technology. We live our lives in a completely different way now compared to past decades because of technological advancements.
Yeah. As you refer to them in the book, Technology's Daughters, Individualism and the Slower Life Strategy. But I was also struck by the fact that it's not necessarily a straight line. And maybe I was just focused on our generation with our version of slower life strategy. So could you expound on that? Not necessarily the straight line.
Yeah. So the slow life strategy, if you take it generation by generation, has kind of gone in fits and starts, and it ends up converging eventually. But so let's take one example. It starts with boomers who start to get married a little bit later than the silent generation right before them, and they definitely have their kids a little bit later than the silents. Then with Gen X, things get a little bit different. Gen X teens were doing adult things very early, maybe even in many cases earlier than boomers. So Gen Xers started to have sex earlier. So the teen pregnancy rate went way up, for example. So Gen X had this shortened childhood, but then they had this long adolescence because they also got married later, had kids later, settled into careers later. And then for millennials, things start to snap back into place where they had a longer childhood and a longer adolescence and a longer young adulthood. And then that accelerates with Gen Z, where you really see the things that parents of teenagers have noticed. But if you don't have teen kids, are often a surprise to people that teens are now actually less likely than previous generations to have sex, to drink alcohol, to have a paid job, to have a driver's license, all of those things that adults do and children don't.
Yeah. And once we start to dig into the specific generations, there were also a number of surprising observations. For example, just starting with the first one that you look at, you mentioned the greatest generation, but the first one you really dive into are the silents. I always attributed huge movements like women's rights, civil rights, gay rights to boomers. But when we look at it, it's really the silent generation.
It was, yeah. So you think about all of those changes that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the movement for gay rights. Those were, for the most part, led by silence and sometimes greatest generation. Boomers were sometimes participating, but they weren't the initiators of it. So one way to illustrate this is two members of the silent generation, Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah. Dr. King and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, the silent generation, civil rights, women's rights, even before she was a Supreme Court justice, yes. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was leading cases that made huge progress. And even to this day, President Biden, silent generation. So that was one of the surprising things. Was there anything about our gen? Are we good at anything? Gen X? Are we good at anything?
I'll tell you, even though Gen X is my generation, that was in many ways the most challenging chapter to write.
Yeah.
Because we're smaller generation by numbers. We're also kind of a transition between, boomers and millennials. But, we do represent some changing points in terms of away from boomers' idealism toward a more practical focus. Sometimes that comes out in ways like more materialism, less trust. One thing I think does also really distinguish Gen X, which is a little bit more fun, is our love of shared pop culture. So I think we were really the last generation to have a unified pop culture experience. So we
Right.
love our pop culture. We love talking about it. And that was a really fun part of the book to write.
Yeah, growing up, latchkey kids going and watching Brady Bunch reruns, and then
Exactly.
feeling really cool early teens, and I want my MTV. And it's,
Mhm.
when I go back to my high school reunions, it's all, to your point. It's so much of it is a shared experience. In terms of millennials, one thing I was really surprised is that they're actually doing better financially than prior generations. The impression is very different. So can you explain why the prevailing impression is different than the reality?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a mystery. So, just for background, median incomes for 25 to 44-year-olds are at all-time highs, and that is corrected for inflation. The St. Louis Fed has done studies of wealth building, and millennials are now neck and neck with Gen X because there'd been the expectation for a long time because of the Great Recession that millennials were not going to do as well as their parents. They're going to be a lost generation in terms of wealth. And that was true for a while after the Great Recession, but it's not true anymore. So I think that perception was a little bit outdated. But I think the reason it didn't get updated, a couple things. I mean, first, there's some stark realities that those gains in income are almost all driven by women, which is good news in a lot of ways. Uh, However, then if you're thinking about a heterosexual couple and they want to have kids, then you got to pay for daycare. So that's a burden if you're going to keep both of those relatively high incomes. And then there's also a couple other pieces, of course, college loans, although that hasn't necessarily um, held millennials back from building wealth. It's probably actually one of the reasons why their median incomes are higher is because of more going to college. So there are certainly some challenges in there economically, but even with that, there's a huge difference between how well millennials are actually doing according to, government statistics. I mean, if occasionally, not even just occasionally, a lot of times, anytime other people talk about this online, the immediate response is you must be wrong. And, my response to that without, you know, trying to hold back from being too snarky, but truthfully, take it up with the US Census Bureau. Take it up with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's where these stats are coming from. These are pretty reliable sources, and we know that these numbers are really solid. So why is there that disconnect? And I think there's a couple of reasons. Um, a lot of it, I think, is that online discussions tend to bias toward the negative.
Mm,
So on social media, things that are negative and anger provoking get clicks. Bad news gets clicks. Good news does not. So those studies from the St. Louis Fed are a great example. When they said millennials are going to be a lost generation for wealth, that got all kinds of coverage. When
yeah.
they came out, 4 or 5 years later and said actually millennials have caught up, nobody really paid attention. And I think it's just part of our online environment now, our social media environment, that you can't, at least on Twitter and those other types of platforms, you can't go on and say, actually I'm doing really well. My generation's actually doing really well. It's like it's not the norm. The norm is complaint and anger and everything is terrible.
Yeah, yeah. As a trained psychologist, you can appreciate. I've been reading some books on neuroscience and what's referred to as the negativity bias. I think I'm using that term correctly. That we tend to, and it's interesting because one of the things that really impressed me about your work is your interaction with other academics. You were being criticized in the mid 20 teens when you were first putting out an early theory about the connection between the iPhone, social media, the pervasiveness of the iPhone and social media, and our mental health crisis.
Mhm.
So, I'll let you tease out what some of those criticisms were and how you reacted to them. But that really struck me how the ongoing dialogue, and in a way, it seemed to sharpen your game as an academic.
Yeah, I think it did. And, when it's done well, that's what academic debate is supposed to do. I don't think this particular debate was done particularly well. We could get to that because I think a lot of it ended up being counterproductive in some ways. But that is what it can do, and it did to an extent was help, sharpen thinking, make sure those arguments are solid. I mean, this is ideally how it's supposed to work. Let's let the ideas fight it out, and the strong ones will survive. So, this really starts with looking at the mental health surveys for teens primarily, where, I've been working with these big surveys for a long time. They're nationally representative, they're big. A lot of them get a sample of thousands, every year. And I started to see these sudden changes that more and more teens started to say they felt lonely and left out, that they felt like they couldn't do anything right, that their life wasn't useful, that they didn't enjoy life. Those last three are classic symptoms of depression. Then it started to show up in other places too. Clinical level depression among teens ended up doubling between 2011 and 2019. So even before the pandemic. So we're not even talking about, the adolescent mental health crisis being due to the pandemic. Nope, it was happening almost 10 years before the pandemic when it started to rise. So, and I mentioned just 3 indicators. There's about 10 more. It's extremely consistent. It shows up in behaviors, not just symptom reports. So things like emergency room admissions for self-harm, emergency room admissions for suicide attempts, completed suicides. I mean, you name it, it all started to go wrong around the same time in the early 2010s. So that, of course, begs the question of why. What happened? Yeah. What happened around that time that could explain that? And at first, I had no idea. It was misaligned with economic trends. That's when the U.S. economy finally started to improve. It was hard to think of any event that happened then and then kept going in the same direction that had a big effect on teens. But the end of 2012 is when the first time that the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also in some of these same surveys when social media use moved from optional to virtually mandatory among teens. It's around the time Facebook bought Instagram. Social media started to take on its more current character at being more image focused, focusing on likes and followers in a way that it wasn't before. So there's a lot of things happening around this time. And then for teens anyway, they also started spending less time with their friends face to face and less time sleeping. So that more time online, less time with friends face to face, less time sleeping, that's pretty objectively not a good recipe for mental health.
Right.
So then with critics, there was the idea of, well, can it be something else? You can't prove that it's the smartphone or social media because it's not an experiment, it's correlational. That's absolutely true. We have to go on the data that we've got. You cannot randomly assign people to be born at different times. You can't do the random assignment experiment. So we have to go on what we've got. But that was good because I think that spurred me and others to think about alternative explanations. And there really wasn't anything else that fit. There were a few other things that changed at that time, like say the opiate epidemic, but that was regional. The trend in mental health was national. And even more, the opiate epidemic, that was middle-aged people. It wasn't teens. So it didn't fit in the way that smartphones did. Plus, smartphones and social media and all these changes, there was a fundamental change in how teens spent their time outside of school. If anything's going to have an impact, it's going to be that. It's something about their day-to-day lives. So that really fit. And then the other thing that critics would bring up is the link among individuals in terms of how much time people spend on social media and depression. And I think that took several years to work itself out. And the data is now pretty clear on that as a general rule, those who are using social media to excess, say 5 or more hours a day, are about twice as likely to be depressed as those who aren't using it very much.
Yeah. And it's interesting because if you look at prior generations, you would look at the silence, for example, And one would think that if it is based on historic events, folks that are born during the Depression and came to their, early years during World War II, many lost their parents, that would affect mental health in a huge way. But it really wasn't. It turns out that if you look at silence at specific age groups and how they dealt with other future historic events, the mental health of Millennials, and even more so with Gen Z, was much greater, and it was tied directly to these technological events or technological advances. So one of the things I did want to add, so I'd be remiss if I did one of my favorite quotes in the book, if I didn't ask you about this, going back to Millennials for a second. And speaking of how sexually active, this is going to be the one take. I know that my friend who does the social media, this is the one that she's going to take. Anyway, and speaking of how sexually active millennials are, you mentioned the existence of dating apps and how few worry about the morality of premarital sex. And you being the renowned, very erudite, highly educated individual that you are, the way you put it was, it should be a formula for lots of boinking, but it's not. Help me understand.
Yeah, do you know where I got that? So this is my Gen X roots and my pop culture coming out. My favorite TV show of all time, which is Moonlighting. So Bruce Willis's character, David Addison, that is his chosen verb for the human sexual act. And that's where I got that. Okay,
lots of boinking.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Now, on a more serious note, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, it really did get me thinking, it's about life goals. Specifically intrinsic versus extrinsic life goals. So first, can you explain the difference? And then could you provide examples of how this plays out across the different generations?
Yeah. So there's some great background in psychology on this about extrinsic goals, things like money, fame, and image, and then intrinsic goals, self-understanding, helping others, relationships. And that's one of the fundamental shifts that really occurred, especially between boomers and Gen X, that continued with millennials and Gen Z, is more of a shift toward extrinsic values. So being more practical, focusing more on the end outcome rather than these more abstract things, which is where boomers were more comfortable. Things like developing a meaningful philosophy of life. Most boomer college students said that was important. Once you get to Gen X, and later, most said it wasn't. Becoming very well off financially, a much more extrinsic and practical goal, was not as important to boomers. And then in samples more recently of late millennials and then Gen Z, has been at all-time highs. About 83% of incoming college students have said that goal was important.
Wow. Yeah, and especially, it ties so many things together of what you talk about in the book. For us, the slow life strategy, I hit an age, I guess it was a combination of things. There was a historic event called the pandemic that forced a lot of us to hit the brakes on life. And it came for us at a time when that often naturally happens. You're transitioning into a different stage of your vocational life, right? So it got me thinking about, I'm not young, but I'm not old. I know I look really old. I don't look a day older than 78. I know that's what people tell me. Anyway, but in all seriousness, Lisa and I, we're not old. So what does this next chapter look like? And it had a lot more to do with David Brooks wrote a book a few years ago called The Second Mountain. And it was very much about that, where we have a better understanding of what we're good at and what we enjoy. But what gives us a sense of meaning? And I think it speaks to that concept of intrinsic life goals. So it's interesting. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about the future because you do really tie it all together. So if you could talk a little bit about the future of work, the future of family, the future of politics, doing this work, it really gives you a good launching pad to take a decent look, at least into the near and not too distant future. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's the last chapter of Generations. And with that, I drew from a lot of sources, some of which was newspaper articles, qualitative, people speculating, but then also what's great about having data on teens is it does give you a little bit of view into the future. You get data on 13-year-olds, then you can kind of see what's coming. And that's what some of these big data sets have. So with work, the biggest shift over the generations, when you're looking at 18-year-olds who are talking about, filling out surveys about what they want out of a job and what values are important to them, the biggest generational shift is work-life balance. So we've heard about that for a while. So that looks like it's going to stick around as the theme. The other thing that was really striking for Gen Z, who's now almost all the young employees being hired, is that they really want to help other people. So that as a goal overall, and also in a job where they can be, the way the survey items worded is directly helpful to others. And that's where they really stand out compared to previous generations. So I think organizations that can, pay attention to that empathy in this generation will serve themselves well, and not focus on some of the kind of, stereotypes or myths in this area. The idea that they all want to make friends at work. They've got plenty of friends on Instagram. So generations more recently, they're actually less focused on making friends at work, actually a little less focused on having a job that's interesting, that's still important to them, but it's less important than previous generations. So, but that helping piece is really striking. Then for family, like one of the biggest considerations is to look at the birth rate. And so the birth rate has been going down for quite a while. At first, people thought it was because of the Great Recession, but then it kept going down. And is it going to keep going down? And I think it clearly is. Because again, you look at that survey data, teens, it turned a corner again with that transition between millennials and Gen Z. Gen Z is less likely to say that they want to have children. And millennials were just as likely as Gen Xers and boomers to say at 18 that they wanted to have kids and then they didn't. Gen Z is not even saying that at 18. So I think that birth rate is going to continue to go down. That's going to have big ripple effects for demographics, families, marketing, just everything across the board. May see some changes in those areas. I have a couple things in there on just changes in consumer behavior. I think, birth rate's a good place to start with some of that. Maybe because I live in Southern California, I think about real estate a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that there will still continue to be a demand for larger houses, even though people have smaller families. If we still have the idea of working from home or even doing hybrid, maybe you still want 4 bedrooms, that then you have, a master bedroom, a guest room, and then 2 for offices. So I think we're still going to want larger houses.
Interesting. So much there. What about the future of politics? Are we always going to be this divided, or is there some light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, that's really the question, right? We can definitely see that political polarization even among our youngest voters. So it shows up among those 18-year-olds filling out those surveys, where they are also more polarized, just like older adults are. So not anytime soon is the unfortunate answer in terms of the end of any polarization. I do think there's opportunities there. There's certainly some signs in the surveys of challenges around free speech, but there's also a lot of indication that a lot of people are sick of some of those debates. So I think going forward, we may see more progress around that.
Yeah. Half the reason of your reasoning behind calling the youngest generation right now after Gen Z pollers,
Yes.
Partly for the polarized caps, but partly for the polarization. So at the very end of the book, you say, this is the challenge for all 6 generations in the decades to come, to find a way for technology to bring us together instead of driving us apart. But I want to ask you a very specific question about that, which I won't give away the end. I kind of did give away the end of the book, but I want to ask you our TPNR question, talk politics and religion without killing each other question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences, people who think differently than we do, who are born in different generations than we are, who have different beliefs and get their news from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
I think it is possible. And I think one way to think about doing that is your venue. Are you having that conversation with that person on Facebook, or are you having that conversation with that person in the same room face to face? Because those are going to be two very different conversations, and you're going to be a lot more likely to really learn from each other and to not be aggressive and, in your words, kill each other if you're in person. If you're in person. I mean, we know this from so much research in psychology that when people are anonymous or even feel anonymous, they're more aggressive toward each other. They get more angry. Online conversations, unfortunately, tend to lend themselves to that. But if you're, sitting across from Uncle Bob, who maybe voted for someone different from you can really talk to him about what his life is like and why he feels that way. You may not end up agreeing with him, but you'll learn something about his perspective. And that's best done if you're sitting in the same room.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite stories doing this work is a fellow named Daryl Davis. You might have heard of him. He's an African-American musician who's traveled all around the country, all around the world. And he's befriended dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of KKK and now former KKK members. And one of the stories he tells is one of the first times this happened, it was a grand wizard in the Southeast. And the guy approached him after one of his sets and he said, I like your music. You play real good. I didn't think, you could play that way. And he said, yeah, I like it too. Why don't we grab a beer? And the KKK guy said, don't you know who the hell I am? He's like, yeah, let's go grab a beer. And once you sit down and humanize that person, whatever they look like, whatever their background is, it really, and you're face to face with them. There's more, I don't know. We are a tactile creature at the end of the day. There's something about human connection that just can't be communicated through just articulating 240 characters or less. So actually, I kind of got ahead of myself. So I should ask you if you have any questions for me.
Well, what type of things do you usually advise in that area of how we can talk about these things without killing each other, like with previous guests or your own philosophy? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, there are a few things, and a lot of it is just from doing this, not doing it very well often, and then trying to learn from that and do it better, trying to learn from others who have done it better. So one of the things I've learned is emphasizing the relational over the transactional. It's kind of, to your point. The transactional means when we're online, even if we have an existing relationship with that person, we fall into the trap of this contest, this transactional interaction, where I'm going to say the perfect thing, send the perfect rhetorical zinger, and I'm going to win this contest. That doesn't do anything. It's very impulsive and it might feel satisfying in the moment, but it really doesn't do anything. Whereas if we're nurturing the relationship, like Monica Guzman and Braver Angels, John Rausch was on recently and reminded me of this. One of the tricks, if you want to call it that, when you're talking to someone is what in your life, tell me about your life. What life experiences did you have that led to this position that you now hold? And then it opens up a story so that you can understand the human being underneath that. So that's one of the ways. Other ways is just recognizing our own boiling points, I guess. So if we need to step away, if we need to go do meditation or have some ice cream or something, we can step away so that it doesn't become this, kind of animalistic rage war. But I do find myself, number one, I do try to, when you're a public figure, like yourself, it's hard to do this all the time, but I do try to get into conversations with people online when there is the context of an existing relationship. That way, if it gets to a certain point and it's getting out of hand, you can always say, hey, buddy, let's go grab a beer. Like Daryl Davis said, hey, why don't we go grab some coffee or something? I'd love to get together for dinner with you, because if you're in person, there is that real connectedness, and there's you're risking something in a way, but you're connecting in a more meaningful way. So that's kind of a potpourri of some of the things that come to mind. But really, at the end of the day, I'm still learning it. I'm still messing up. I'm still struggling with my own trajectory and how this is going. But we're doing our best to try to get better each day. So I wanted to ask you before we close to share a bit with the audience about a friend of yours. It was really touching in the acknowledgments, your literary agent, and I think I'm saying the name correctly, Jill Knierim or Knierim?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about Jill and what she meant to you?
Sure. And I may tear up. So I first met Jill in 2003. So 20 years ago. I was a young assistant professor. But I had always wanted to write a book. So I'd, written for my college newspaper, like the idea of, writing for a more popular audience. And I was at a psychology conference in Boston and talked to some folks. There was a session on, academics writing a popular book, and really, met Jill there. She's a founder of her own literary agency, a real trailblazer, and just she's a wonderful, warm person. And so she became my literary agent, helped me get my first book deal, and helped me develop the idea for this most recent book, because I had been writing books on each generation, usually each young generation. And but I've been getting questions at talks a lot about, like, doesn't technology affect all of us? What kind of impact is this having on everybody? And she said, well, what that means, you need to write a book about all the generations. So I was like, wow, that sounds really hard. But makes sense at this point in my career that's maybe what I'd want to write, and we have the data for it now. So that might be a great idea. And Jill died of cancer before I was able to finish the book. She was 83. She just never wanted to retire. Just such an inspiration. She was so amazing at what she did and loved doing it. So I was cleaning out my files a few months after she died in preparation for a move, and I found a note that she wrote after the process of selling my first book happened, where that process always is going to involve a fair amount of rejection. It turned out happily in the end, but that's just always how that goes. And it was a handwritten note from her, clipped to some printed out emails, and it said, "For your files or your rubbish, here are the emails from the fools who didn't want to offer." And I burst out laughing and then started crying, because that was her in a nutshell. She was amazing. She was always in your corner. Hard negotiator, but an extremely warm and wonderful person.
That's awesome. So before we go, how can we follow you? You have a Substack. How can we find the Substack and more information about Generations and all your other wonderful, wonderful work?
Yeah, so my Substack, it's brand new. I've only done a few posts. It's called Generation Tech. So I'm going to use that to post some sometimes original analyses, sometimes explainers for new journal articles that come out, just things that are relevant to generational differences, to the impact of technology. Some people do those about once a week. Mine's going to be more like once a month, because I really want them to be a bigger impact. I'm not just going to post on little stuff. I'm going to try to have it focus on big stuff. My website is www.genetwenge.com, and that's got all the stuff about all of the books and the speaking engagements too, because I do a lot of speaking engagements for parents, for corporations on generations in the workplace, on college campuses for my fellow faculty, and also student life staff who are kind of on the front lines with Gen Z these days. So really enjoying those picking up after after the pandemic. Again, being able to be with people in person and give talks and hear people laugh.
Yeah,
Really
that's
wonderful
awesome.
to do again. Yeah.
It's amazing. My dogs, I'm convinced they know how to read clocks because they get fed at 4 o'clock. And they both came into my office just like it's almost exactly 4 o'clock.
There you go.
Giving me crap.
They've got the circadian rhythm down.
That's right.
Yep.
They're spoiled. So is there anything important I forgot to ask you before we close?
I think we covered a lot. It was great.
We did cover a lot of ground. This was a ton of fun. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. It's really great getting to know you personally a lot better after reading so much of your work. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button. Like I said before, the subscribe, rate, review, it really, really does help. And tell a friend about Talk Politics and Religion. Maybe you could tell them, hey, I heard this conversation with Dr. Jean Twenge, and she talked about the generations. I thought she was totally wrong. What do you think? And you get into a conversation, but try not to kill each other, right? But you can find us. We're easy to recommend. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E and S as in Sam at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion, but with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.